The stagecoach was already going 60 yards past the point where any sane man would have given up, and Dexter Donnelly was not a sane man. He was a cowboy with nothing left to lose, and he threw himself at those reins like the whole miserable story of his life depended on what happened in the next 30 seconds. The year was 1878, and the Arizona Territory had a way of burning everything down to its essential truth. The sun came at you sideways in the late afternoon, turning the red bluffs the color of open wounds, and the dust that rose from the Prescott Road moved like a living thing, coiling and twisting behind the iron-rimmed wheels of the Butterfield Line's number 7 coach. Dexter had been riding the ridge trail above that road for the better part of 3 hours, pushing his roan mare, Cinder, at a steady clip toward the settlement at Copper Cross, where he had a week's work lined up breaking horses for Walt Hennessy. It was not glamorous work. It was not the kind of work a man bragged about in a saloon. But it was honest, and honesty was about the only currency Dexter Donnelly had traded in since he left Tucson 18 months ago without so much as a word to a single living soul about where he was headed. He heard the horses before he saw the stage. 4 animals screaming in pure terror, their iron shoes striking sparks off the rocky road below. He came over the ridge and pulled Cinder up hard, and for one suspended moment he just watched the driver gone, the box empty, the long leather reins dragging and snapping against the wheel spokes, and the stage itself rocking so violently on its thoroughbrace that it looked ready to tear itself apart against the canyon wall that waited around the next long curve. He did not think about it. Thinking had never been Dexter Donnelly's strong suit, and on that particular afternoon in the autumn of 1878, that failing turned out to be the best thing about him. He put his heels to Cinder and they dropped off the ridge at an angle that was closer to falling than riding, cutting down through the scrub and the loose shale to intercept the road 100 yards ahead of the Runaway team. Cinder was a good horse. She did not flinch when the screaming animals bore down on them. She held her line. Dexter came alongside the lead horse, a big gray with a broken harness trace flying beside it like a flag of pure catastrophe, and he did what any reasonable man would have told him was impossible. He stood up in his stirrups, grabbed the gray's headstall with both hands, and threw his entire weight against the animal's momentum, pulling and hauling and speaking in that low, even voice that he reserved for horses and frightened children, the voice that came from somewhere below language, from the place where the body understands what words cannot say. The gray fought him. The gray was terrified, and it had every right to be. The Wheeler horses behind it were still driving forward. The stage was still swaying. The canyon wall was maybe 40 yards away, and the road curved hard to the right. Dexter's hands were bleeding where the headstall leather cut into them. His shoulders screamed. His boots left the stirrups entirely, and for 10 long, horrible seconds, he was simply hanging in the air between his own horse and the Runaway team, his boots dragging furrows in the red dirt of the Prescott Road. Then the gray began to feel the pressure. Then the gray began to slow. He got his feet back under him somehow, found the ground with his boot heels, dug in, and the whole terrible procession ground to a halt 20 yards from the canyon wall, in a cloud of dust so thick that for a moment Dexter could not see his own hands. He stood there. He breathed. His hands were shaking and his shoulders felt like they had been pulled halfway out of their sockets, but he was standing. And then he heard it, a voice, from inside the coach. "Is someone out there? Is anyone, please, is someone out there?" It was a woman's voice, and not just any woman's voice. It was a voice that Dexter Donnelly had been hearing in his sleep for a year and a half, a voice he had been running from since the morning he rode out of Tucson without saying goodbye, because saying goodbye to Della Barrett would have been the same as admitting that he was a coward, and he had not been ready to admit that yet. He walked to the coach door on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. He put his hand on the handle. He opened the door. Della Barrett looked at him the way a person looks at a thing they have stopped believing in. Her dark hair had come loose from whatever arrangement it had started the morning in, and it was around her shoulders now, wild with the static electricity of fear. There was a long scratch on her left cheek, where the window glass had grazed her when the coach went over a rock. Her eyes were the same gray-green that Dexter had spent 18 months trying to forget, that particular color that existed nowhere else on Earth except in her face, and in some very specific quality of the Arizona sky just before a thunderstorm. She was 24 years old. He was 27. Those numbers felt very far away. Dexter, she said, just the single word, just his name in that voice. Della, he said, and then, because he was a man more comfortable with action than with speech, he held out his bleeding hands to help her down from the step, and she took them. She did not let go right away. She stood in the road with the dust still settling around them and the horses still blowing hard and trembling, and she held his hands and looked at the cuts across his palms, and her expression did something complicated that Dexter could not fully read. He had never been entirely able to read Della Barrett's expression, which was part of what had made him so afraid of her. "Hurt," she said. "I've been worse," he said. "I know you have," she said, and the way she said it contained everything that had ever passed between them, all of it compressed into 4 small words, and the gray-green look she leveled at him from under her loosened hair. He pulled his hands back. He needed them back. He needed some distance between himself and the warmth of her grip, because distance was what he had built his last 18 months on, and old habits die hard on the Arizona high desert. He went to check the horses. Della stood in the road and watched him go, and she did something she had not done since she read the note he left on her father's porch, the note that said nothing except "I'm sorry," which was true and also completely inadequate. She felt angry. Not frightened. Not relieved. Angry the way you get angry at a thing you love that has let you down, the specific fury that is only available to the heart that has been disappointed by something it trusted. She pushed her hair back from her face. She straightened her traveling coat, which was pale blue broadcloth and now covered in red Arizona dust. She had been traveling from Tucson to Prescott to take a position as a schoolteacher at the settlement at Copper Cross, a position that her father's friend Judge Calloway had arranged for her after the previous teacher, a Mr. Horace Webb, had departed under circumstances that the judge described as unfortunate, and that everyone in the territory knew meant the man had fled his gambling debts eastward. It was a good position. It was a new start. It was everything Della Barrett had been building toward for a year and a half, while Dexter Donnelly was nowhere. And now Dexter Donnelly was here. Standing in the middle of the Prescott Road with blood on his hands, talking to a gray horse in that low, steady voice that she had loved before she even knew she loved him. The driver, she discovered, had been thrown from the box when the team first bolted, back near the Dry Creek crossing. He had struck his head on a rock and been knocked unconscious, but when Dexter and Della rode back to find him, Della up on cinder behind Dexter, her hands on his waist because there was nowhere else to put them, which was its own particular kind of cruelty. They found him sitting up and blinking in the afternoon sun. His name was Gus Parcell, a broad, sun-damaged man of about 50 with a gray beard and the philosophical disposition of a man who has been thrown from horses and stages many times before. "Lost the brake line," Gus said, touching the gash on his head with the practiced air of a man assessing minor damage. "Hit that drop just past the creek and the whole rear line snapped. Horses spooked at the sound and I went off the box when they jumped." He looked at Dexter. "You stopped that team." "The horses stopped themselves mostly," Dexter said. Gus looked at Dexter's hands. "Uh-huh," he said, with the tone of a man who has heard enough polite understatement to last a lifetime. They got Gus up onto the driver's box, where he declared himself capable of managing the reins with Dexter riding alongside as outrider, and they made their slow way toward Copper Cross in the long orange light of the late afternoon. The team was calm now, still trembling in their traces but willing, and Dexter rode beside them close enough to put a hand on the lead horse's neck whenever the animal's ears went back. which was often enough in the first mile and less often after that. Della rode inside the coach because there was nowhere else to ride, and she watched Dexter through the window, and she thought about what she was going to say to him when they arrived in Copper Cross, and she could not decide whether it would be something precise and cold or something she would immediately regret. With Dexter Donnelly, she had always been better at regretting things than planning them. She had met him 3 years ago at the Tucson Territorial Fair, which was a modest affair by the standards of the eastern states, but was the kind of event that the whole population of southern Arizona Territory treated as the social occasion of the year. Her father, Thomas Barrett, ran the largest dry goods establishment in Tucson, Barrett & Sons, though there were in fact no sons, only Della, who had learned the accounts and the inventory and the ordering and the entire machinery of the business, while her father's eyesight slowly failed him. She had come to the fair with her father and with their neighbor Mrs. Constance Ruiz, who was 60 years old and had opinions about everything that happened within 50 miles of Tucson. Dexter had been competing in the riding exhibitions. He was not the flashiest rider, not the kind of man who stood on his horse's back or threw his hat in the air and caught it with his knee. He was the kind of rider who made the horse look like the horse wanted to be doing exactly what it was doing, which is a much harder thing to accomplish and much less visually dramatic, but which Della had recognized immediately as the superior skill. She had pointed this out to Mrs. Ruiz, who had agreed with enthusiasm, and somehow in the process of agreeing they had both ended up standing at the rail closer to the exhibitor's gate, and Dexter had walked out of that gate leading a big bay horse, and he had met Della's eyes, and she had said, without any particular plan, "You're the best rider here." He had looked genuinely surprised, as if the compliment had come from a direction he was not watching. "Thank you, ma'am," he had said, and then, "I don't usually agree with people about things like that, but you're right." She had laughed. She had not expected to laugh. The sound of her own laughter surprised her slightly, and she saw him notice that surprise, and something in his face shifted, something careful opened up, like a door in a wall that you had not realized had a door. His name was Dexter Donnelly, she learned, and he was from Texas originally, and he had been working cattle and breaking horses throughout the Arizona Territory for about 4 years. He had a reputation, she learned later from Mrs. Ruiz, who knew everything, for being entirely dependable and entirely solitary. He did his work. He did it better than anyone else. He did not drink to excess, did not gamble, did not fight unless someone pushed him past a particular point, and then he fought with a quiet efficiency that discouraged repetition. He had no family that anyone knew of, no particular plans, and no apparent needs beyond the work and the horse and the sky and the road. He began calling on her 2 weeks after the fair. He would come to Barrett & Sons on Saturday afternoons and buy things he did not especially need: a length of rope, a new set of leather gloves, a can of neatsfoot oil, and they would talk across the counter for an hour, and then he would leave, and she would find herself thinking about the conversation for the rest of the week. He was not romantic in any conventional sense. He did not bring flowers or write poems or say the kinds of things that the dime novels her friend Clara Reed devoured described as the proper approach to courtship. He just talked to her. He told her things about the horses he was breaking, about the country he had ridden through, about a hawk he had watched hunt a jackrabbit for 40 minutes one morning on the flats east of Saguaro Springs, about the particular way the light changed in the canyon country after rain. And he listened. That was the thing that undid her, finally, more than anything else. He listened to her the way no one else had since her mother died, with his full attention, without looking over her shoulder for something more interesting, without that faint impatience that most men deployed when a woman was talking about something they had already decided was not important. When Della talked, Dexter Donnelly gave her the same focused stillness that he gave his horses, and she had understood eventually that this was the deepest compliment he knew how to pay. They had been walking together, Sunday afternoons, along the irrigation canal east of town for almost a year. Her father liked him. Mrs. Ruiz declared him suitable but mysterious, which was her highest form of praise. Della had been, she thought, beginning to love him in the steady, accumulating way that she believed was the only honest kind of love, not the sudden crash of it but the slow filling, like water rising in a well. And then Thomas Barrett had been thrown by a horse, just a rented livery horse, nothing dramatic, a simple stumble on an uneven patch of road, and the fall had broken his hip and his right leg in 2 places. The injury had revealed what the doctor called complications that no one had suspected, a weakness in Thomas Barrett's heart that the physical shock had aggravated, and within 3 weeks the prognosis was not good, and within 5 weeks Thomas Barrett was dead. Della had been 22 years old. She had buried her father and settled his accounts, and discovered that Barrett and Sons was significantly less solvent than she had believed, because her father, gentle, capable, beloved Thomas Barrett, had been extending credit for years to men who had never intended to repay it, and the store was mortgaged, and the mortgager was a man named Clifton Hoare, who was not gentle or beloved but who was very interested in the building and the land it stood on. Now that the Santa Fe Railroad was making noise about running a line through the south end of Tucson, Clifton Hoare had given Della 60 days. In those 60 days, she had done everything she could think of. She had written letters. She had called in what debts could be called in. She had spoken to the bank, which was polite and unhelpful. She had spoken to Judge Calloway, who was helpful in ways that took time she did not have. And in the middle of all of it, Dexter had been there, and she had leaned on him more than she had intended to, because when a person is the only still point in a turning world you lean toward them without meaning to, and she had leaned, and he had held. She had told him she loved him on a Tuesday evening in April, standing by the canal, with the cottonwoods just coming into leaf and the smell of water in the dry air. She had not planned to say it. It had come out of some essential honesty in her, the kind of honesty that Thomas Barrett had put in her from childhood, the belief that a true thing must be said, even when it is inconvenient. Dexter had gone very still. He had looked at her for a long time. He had opened his mouth and she had watched something struggle on his face, something he was not able to make into words, and then he had said quietly, "Della, I need you to know I am not a man who is good at staying." She had understood what he meant and she had been hurt by it, and she had told him, as steadily as she could manage, that she was not asking him to stay anywhere. She was only telling him a true thing. She thought he deserved to know. He had walked her home. He had held her hand while he walked her home, which was the most physical contact they had ever had, and at her door he had looked at her with that expression she couldn't fully read, that complicated, careful expression, the door and the wall, and then he had kissed her once briefly with a gentleness that was almost unbearable and said good night. 3 days later she found the note on the porch. "I'm sorry." That was all. Just those 2 words in his careful, slightly cramped handwriting, and he was gone. She had stood on the porch with that note in her hand for a long time. Then she had gone inside and eaten her breakfast and written the letter to Judge Calloway about the school-teaching position in Copper Cross and begun the practical business of rebuilding her life on entirely different foundations. She had been angry for a long time. Then she had been sad. Then she had been, mostly, just tired of both, and had turned her considerable capacity for hard work toward the future instead of the past. She was good at that, at turning toward what was forward rather than backward. Her father had been the same way. It was a Barrett family characteristic, the willingness to move through grief and into the next day. But she had not forgotten him. She had not been able to do that, and on her most honest evenings she had not tried very hard. Copper Cross was a settlement of about 300 people in 1878, situated in a valley between 2 ridges of the Bradshaw Mountains, sustained by a combination of cattle ranching, silver mining, and the general commerce that grows up wherever enough people gather and need things. It had a main street of about a quarter mile, with a general store, a hotel called the Bradshaw House, a saloon called the Two-Bit, a barber shop, a church that served as the schoolroom on weekdays, a livery stable, a doctor's office, and a small courthouse where Judge Calloway presided 3 days a week when court was in session. There was also, at the far end of the main street, a small adobe house that had been set aside for the school teacher, with a garden in the back that the previous teacher had let go to weeds. Gus Parcell drove the stage into Copper Cross just as the sun dropped behind the western ridge, and the main street was painted in shades of amber and shadow. A small crowd gathered at the stage stop, as crowds always did, because the arrival of the Butterfield line was still, in 1878, an event that signified connection to the wider world, and people came to see what and who it had brought. Judge Calloway was there. He was a tall man, angular and white-haired, with the bearing of a man who had once been a soldier and had never entirely stopped being one. He had known Thomas Barrett for 20 years and had liked him enormously, and he had been kind to Della in the way that powerful men are sometimes genuinely kind to the children of men they have respected, with a practical warmth that does not mistake helpfulness for sentiment. He took one look at Della climbing down from the stage with road dust in her hair and a scratch on her cheek, took another look at Dexter Donnelly dismounting beside the stage with blood dried on his hands, and said, "Gus, what in the hell happened on the road?" Gus Parcell gave a succinct account of the brake failure and the Runaway and Dexter's intervention, which he delivered with the kind of bone-dry understatement that made the whole thing sound simultaneously more and less dramatic than it had actually been. By the end of it, a dozen people were looking at Dexter with expressions ranging from admiration to outright disbelief. Dexter looked profoundly uncomfortable with all of it. He was a man who preferred to do things rather than be observed doing them, and he endured the attention with the pained stoicism of a man who has earned the right to his privacy and resents having it publicly removed. "The horses did most of the work," he said again, which was the third time he had said it, and the third time no one had believed him. Judge Calloway shook Dexter's hand. Then he turned to Della and took her hands in both of his and looked at her with that serious, soldierly kindness. "You're all right, Della. I'm perfectly all right," she said. "I'm glad to be here. Walt Hennessy's been asking about a horse breaker," the judge said, looking briefly at Dexter. "You wouldn't be Donnelly, would you? Walt mentioned you were coming up from the south." "That's me," Dexter said. "Good man, Walt," the judge said. "He'll take care of you. Livery stables at the end of the street, they'll have a stall for your horse." He paused with the precise social instinct of a man who has noticed things that others have not. "You two know each other, I take it." "We've met," Dexter said. "We know each other," Della said, at the same moment, and the slight difference in the two answers sat in the air between them like a sentence that wasn't finished yet. The judge chose not to pursue it. He took Della's arm and walked her toward the Bradshaw house, where she would stay until the schoolteacher's house was made ready, and Dexter watched her go, and then he turned and led Cinder down the street toward the livery, and that was the end of the first night in Copper Cross. He could not sleep. That was not new. Dexter Donnelly had not slept well since Tucson, and most of the time he had managed it by working until he was too tired to stay awake, and then sleeping the heavy, dreamless sleep of physical exhaustion, which was not the same as rest but was at least serviceable. He lay on the cot in the bunkhouse behind the Hennessy ranch. Walt had welcomed him at the livery and insisted he start immediately, which suited Dexter fine, and he stared at the ceiling, and he thought about Della Barrett standing in the road with her hair down and the dust on her, and that expression he could not read. He had been running from her. He knew that. He had known it at the time, though he had not used the word running in the note he left, because men who think of themselves as honest do not like to write the accurate word when the accurate word is shameful. But running was what it was. He had been afraid, and he had run. He was afraid of exactly the thing that made her worth loving, the specificity of her, the way she filled a room not with volume but with presence, The way she told the truth so plainly that it made you feel the obligation to do the same, which was terrifying to a man who had kept his own truths wrapped so tightly for so long that he had nearly forgotten they were there. Della Barrett saw things clearly, and she said what she saw, and the prospect of being seen that clearly by another person had been more than Dexter Donnelly had known what to do with. So he had run. He had ridden north and west and then east and then north again, taking work where he found it, sleeping in bunkhouses and under the open sky, riding through country that asked nothing of him except competence and endurance, which were the two things he had in abundance. And he had been all right. He had been fine. He had been surviving in the efficient, purposeless way that a man survives when he has decided that surviving is enough. And then God or fate or the broken brake line of the Butterfield No. 7 coach had put Della Barrett back in front of him, in a cloud of red Arizona dust, with her hands in his bleeding hands, and everything he had spent 18 months building was back to nothing. Walt Hennessy had 30 horses that needed working, and Dexter threw himself at the task the next morning with a focus that Walt, who was himself a hard worker, found slightly alarming. He was in the corral at first light, and he worked through the morning with the methodical patience that was his hallmark, taking each animal through the sequence that he had developed over years, reading the horse, adjusting to what the horse needed rather than imposing what he had planned. By noon, he had assessed every animal in the string and begun serious work with the first 4, and Walt Hennessy watched from the fence rail and said nothing for a long time, and then said, "You're even better than they said." "They probably said I was fine," Dexter said, not looking up from the horse he was working. "They said you were the best in the territory," Walt said. "I was willing to bet it was exaggeration." "It isn't." Dexter said nothing to that. He kept working. The schoolhouse opened on Monday, and on Monday morning Della Barrett stood at the front of the Copper Cross Church, which was a decent-sized room, with wooden benches and a proper blackboard that the previous teacher had ordered from a company in St. Louis, and which was one of the settlement's proudest possessions, and faced 23 children ranging in age from 6 to 15, and began the work she had come here to do. She was a good teacher. She had always known she would be, in the same way that she had known certain things about herself with a certainty that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with honest self-knowledge. She was patient. She was fair. She had a gift for explanation that came from genuinely caring whether the other person understood, not just whether she had explained. The children responded to her immediately, in the way that children always respond to genuine attention. And by the end of the first week, the school had 3 additional pupils whose parents had heard from other parents that the new teacher was worth going to. She cleaned the weeds out of the garden behind the teacher's house herself, on Saturday morning, with a hoe borrowed from the general store and a practical approach to hard work that would have made her father proud. Mrs. Hennessy, Walt's wife, Ruth, a warm and forthright woman of about 45, came by with a pot of soup and an offer of help that Della accepted gratefully, and they worked together through the afternoon. And by evening the garden had the bones of something that could, with time, become a real kitchen garden. Ruth Hennessy was the kind of woman who found out what needed to be known without appearing to be asking. She knew, within 48 hours of Della's arrival, everything that was commonly known in Copper Cross, and she was making inferences about everything that wasn't. She had also noticed Dexter Donnelly's expression whenever he thought no one was looking and Della Barrett happened to be somewhere in his line of sight. "My husband says that man is the finest horseman he's ever seen," Ruth said, kneeling in the dirt beside Della with a trowel. "Says he works like he's trying to outrun something." "He's always worked that way," Della said, not looking up from the weed she was pulling. Ruth waited. She was good at waiting. "We knew each other in Tucson," Della said finally. "Before I came here." "I gathered that," Ruth said mildly. "It didn't end well," Della said. "Does it ever the first time?" Ruth said. And then briskly, "These beds will need manure worked in before the first frost if you want anything to grow in spring. I'll tell Walt to bring some from the barn." The first time Dexter and Della were in the same room after their arrival in Copper Cross was at Sunday service, 8 days after the Runaway stage. The church filled on Sundays with most of the settlement's inhabitants, and there was no realistic way for either of them to avoid it without being conspicuous, and neither of them was the kind of person who arranged their life around avoiding things. They sat on opposite sides of the room, which everyone who was watching, and quite a few people were watching, because Gus Parcell had told the story of the Runaway stage to anyone who would listen, and the story had taken on considerable dimensions in the retelling, would have noted was deliberate. After the service, in the yard outside, they found themselves within speaking distance of each other while Judge Calloway was holding court with half the settlement around him. It would have been strange not to speak. They were both people who did what was expected in social situations, not because they were conventional, but because they understood the value of the social fabric in a small community where everyone depended on everyone else. "The school is going well," Dexter said. Which was an impersonal thing to say, but it was a start. "It is," Della said. "I like it here." A pause. "Walt Hennessy says you're doing good work with his horses." "Good horses," Dexter said. "The roan with the white stocking is going to be exceptional." They looked at each other. The yard around them was full of conversation and children and the smell of someone's tobacco, and everything between them was so compressed and complicated that it felt like a physical pressure, like the air before a storm. "Dexter," Della said quietly, "I'm not going to pretend that things are ordinary between us. I'm also not going to make things difficult for you. This is a small community and we are both going to be here for a while, and I think the simplest thing is to behave like adults." "I agree," he said. "Good," she said. He nodded. She nodded. And they went their separate ways back through the crowd, and that was that. Except that it wasn't, of course. It was never that simple, and they both knew it. The weeks that followed were a study in what happens when two people who have history try to be neighborly. Copper Cross was small enough that they saw each other regularly, at Sunday service, at the general store, at the occasional community gatherings that the settlement organized with the determined social energy of a place that was still deciding what kind of place it wanted to be. Each encounter was civil. Each encounter was careful. Each encounter cost them both something. October deepened into November, and the Bradshaw Mountains put on their brief autumn spectacle, the aspens on the upper slopes turning gold and the oaks turning rust, and the air in the mornings acquiring that cold, clear edge that made everything seem very precisely defined. Della was busy and satisfied and doing work she believed in, and she told herself that was enough. Dexter broke horses through the day and lay awake at night, and he had a conversation with himself that went around and around without resolution, because the central fact, that he had left Della without a real explanation, without giving her the chance to respond, without anything except 2 words that were true but not sufficient, was a fact he could not talk his way around. He had left because he was afraid. He had been afraid of many things over the course of his life, of his father's temper, of the war his older brother had gone to and not come back from, of the long empty years on the road after Texas, years that had taught him how to need very little and had made him convinced that this was a virtue rather than a wound. He had been afraid of Della Barrett the way you are afraid of a thing that is exactly right for you, because exactly right things cost everything when they go wrong. His father had been that way with his mother, gripping and then crushing, loving badly out of fear of losing. Dexter had watched it as a boy and made himself a private promise that he would never be that man. And in making that promise, he had overcorrected in the other direction, and the overcorrection had cost him the best thing that had happened to him in his entire adult life. He understood this. The problem was not understanding it. The problem was that understanding it didn't tell him what he was supposed to do now, given that he had run, given that she was here and he was here, and the note with 2 words on it was still out there in the past like a splinter you can't quite get at. He decided, in the second week of November, that he was going to say what needed saying. Not the comfortable, circular, late-night version of saying it that happened in his own head, but the actual version, out loud to her face, with no hedge and no qualification and no escape route. He owed her that. He had owed it to her for 18 months, and the debt had only been growing. He was not good at this. He had never been good at this. But he had stopped a runaway 4-horse team by hand, and that had not been something he was good at either, and he had done it anyway because it was necessary. The opportunity came on a Saturday afternoon in mid-November, when Della was in her garden doing the last of the fall preparation, turning the bed soil before the ground froze, working in the manure that Ruth Hennessy had arranged. Dexter had come to return a coil of rope he had borrowed from the Hennessy barn, which was adjacent to the property. He came around the fence and saw her there, her back to him, working with the same focused efficiency that she brought to everything, and he stopped. "Della," he said. She turned. She had a streak of garden dirt on her jaw, and she was flushed from the work, and she looked at him with an expression that was careful and waiting. "I need to talk to you," he said. "All right," she said. She put down the spade and pulled off her work gloves and turned to face him fully, giving him her full attention the way she always did, the way that had always made him feel both seen and accountable. He stood at the garden fence and he told her the truth. He told her about his father and his mother and his brother who didn't come back from the war, and about the years of working and moving and not staying, and about the fear that had undone him the morning he left the note on her porch. He did not make it pretty. He did not try to make himself look better than he had been. He was a man who had been afraid and had run, and he said so plainly in the words that fit the facts. She listened. She did not interrupt. When he was done, she stood quietly for a moment, looking at the turned earth of her garden, and then she looked up at him. "I know about your family," she said, "or some of it. Mrs. Ruiz told me. She made it sound like your father was a difficult man." "That's one word for it," Dexter said. "And you believe that loving someone the way he did was inevitable," she said. "That if you stayed, you'd become that." The accuracy of this was startling. He had not expected her to name it that precisely. "Something like that," he said. "Dexter," she said. "You are the gentlest person I have ever known with a frightened creature, horse, child, whoever. You have it in you to be careful with things you love. I always knew that." A pause. "What I didn't know was whether you knew it." He felt something shift in his chest, something that had been held very tightly for a very long time. "I'm still not sure I know it," he said. "That's honest," she said. "I am trying to be," he said. "I owe you that much." She looked at him for a long time. "You do," she said. "You owe me a great deal more than 2 words on a piece of paper. I know it. But I also know," she said slowly, "that fear is a real thing. It doesn't excuse what you did. But it does explain it." She looked back down at the garden. "I'm not the same person I was in Tucson. My father died and I lost the store and I rebuilt my life from the beginning. I know what I'm capable of now. And I know what I want, and I know I won't accept less than what I'm worth." She looked at him again. "So if you are going to be here, Dexter, you need to decide whether you're going to be here completely. I cannot go through that again." "I understand," he said. "Do you?" she asked. "Or is that just what you're saying?" "I've been sitting up nights for 2 weeks trying to figure out how to say what I just said to you," he said. "That's not something I do for things I'm not sure about." She studied him. He held her gaze because this was the moment and there was no flinching from it. "I'm not giving you an answer today," she said. "I need you to understand that if something is going to happen between us again, it's going to grow slowly. I'm not going to simply pick up where we left off." "I don't expect you to," he said. "I'm not asking for that." "What are you asking for?" "A chance," he said, "to do this properly. To let you see whether I'm capable of staying." She looked at him for a moment longer, and then she picked up her work gloves again. "Then we'll see," she said. "Go return your rope." He went. But he was smiling as he went, which was something that had not happened in a long time, and Ruth Hennessy saw it from the kitchen window and told Walt about it at dinner. And Walt said he reckoned the weather was changing, and Ruth said she reckoned so too, and they left it at that. The winter of 1878 came in hard and early over the Bradshaw Mountains, with snow on the high ridges by the first week of December and ice in the troughs by morning. Copper Cross pulled inward the way small communities do in winter, people spending more time in each other's company out of necessity, the social life of the settlement contracting and intensifying simultaneously. There were dances at the Bradshaw house on Saturday nights, proper dances, with a fiddle and a guitar, and sometimes a man named Ernesto Ruelas who played the accordion with more enthusiasm than precision, but who was enthusiastic enough to make up the difference. Dexter began courting Della Barrett properly, the way he should have done from the beginning. Not with grand gestures were not in his nature, and she would have suspected them anyway, but with the accumulation of small, deliberate attentions that were his honest style. He began by bringing her firewood, because the teacher's house had a small woodpile that was going to run short before February, and he added to it without making a ceremony of it. He borrowed books from the judge's library. The judge had a remarkably good library for a frontier settlement, and brought them to her when he thought she would like them, which she usually did, because he turned out to have a better sense of what she would like than she had expected. He asked about the school, about the children, about what she was teaching and how they were responding, and he listened to the answers with that complete attention that she had never forgotten. He was at the Saturday dances. He asked her to dance exactly once the first Saturday because once was appropriate and she danced with him, and they did not talk during the dance. They just moved through the music together, and the movement said things that neither of them would have been ready to say out loud. He was careful. He was patient. He was not rushing her, and she noticed that he was not rushing her, and she noticed too that his not rushing her was not the absence of wanting, it was the opposite. It was wanting held carefully, held with discipline, offered in the form she had asked for and not the form he would have preferred. Della Barrett, who had spent 18 months being angry and then sad and then practical and then something she refused to name, found herself watching Dexter Donnelly with a softer eye. She found herself trusting what she observed, and what she observed was a man who was trying, genuinely and consistently, to be what he had said he would try to be. December passed. The school went on winter break for 3 weeks, and Della used the time to help Ruth Hennessy make preparations for Christmas, which in Copper Cross was celebrated with more enthusiasm than ceremony. A community dinner in the church hall with dishes brought by every family in the settlement. The Hennessy children, 3 of them, ranging from 8 to 14, had adopted Della with the wholehearted affection of children who recognize a genuinely kind adult, and the lack of one in their immediate vicinity. She helped them decorate the church, and in doing so she was working alongside Dexter, who had been recruited by Walt for the heavy lifting involved in bringing pine boughs down from the ridge. They worked together for a full afternoon, and the quality of the work between them was easy in a way that was new or not entirely new, because the ease had always been there, underneath the fear and the history, but now it was accessible without the fear sitting on top of it. They talked and worked and made each other laugh twice, and the second time they laughed, both of them at once, about one of the Hennessy children attempting to hang an enormous pine bough from a hook that was approximately 4 feet too short. Dexter had put his hand briefly on her arm, and she had not pulled away. On Christmas Eve, after the community dinner, when most of Copper Cross had gone home through the cold night, Dexter walked Della back to the teacher's house. They stood on the small porch in the clear, cold dark, with the stars overhead at that brutal winter brightness that the Arizona high desert produced, and Dexter said, "I want to say something that I should have said a long time ago." She waited. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since that day at the canal when you told me the truth about yourself, and I was too afraid to say it back, and I have been carrying it around ever since, and it has not gotten any lighter." He looked at her. "I don't expect you to say it back. I just wanted you to know it was true, that it has always been true." Della looked at him for a long moment in the cold starlight. Her breath made small clouds in the air between them. "Dexter," she said, "you absolute idiot," he blinked. You could have told me that a year and a half ago, she said. You could have told me that and none of the rest of it would have had to happen. I know, he said. It would have been terrifying, she said. And I would have been patient with you. I would have waited while you figured out how to trust yourself. I know that too, he said. Now, she said. Yes. She looked up at the stars for a moment and then back at him. I love you too, she said. I have for years. I am furious at you for being afraid of it, and I understand why you were, and both of those things are true at the same time. That seems fair, he said. It is fair, she said. And I am also glad you're here. He reached out and took her hand carefully, the way you take something precious that has been nearly broken and you are mindful of how close it came. She let him take it. They stood on the porch together in the cold and the starlight for a long time, not saying much, because the saying had been done. He kissed her good night at the door, properly this time, not the brief and frightened press of lips from the porch in Tucson, but the kind of kiss that is a beginning, that has weight and warmth and intention. She kissed him back. And then she went inside and he walked home through the cold, and that was the end of Christmas Eve. January brought cold, hard work, and the steady deepening of something that neither of them rushed and both of them tended. They went on walks when the weather allowed, out along the ridge trails where the views opened up across the valley, and Dexter talked about horses, and she talked about children and books, and the particular mathematics of the growing season that she was planning for the garden, and they talked about her father, about what he had been and what she had lost, and Dexter listened with the same quality of attention that had undone her in the beginning, and she found herself giving him things she had kept, telling him the parts of the grief she had managed alone, because there had been no one to tell. She asked him about his brother, finally, on a cold Sunday afternoon when they were walking the high trail with Cinder ambling behind them on a loose lead. His brother's name had been James, she learned. James Donnelly had been 3 years older than Dexter and had been, by everything Dexter said, the best version of their father's nature, steady and strong and capable of a warmth that their father had only shown in fragments. James had gone to fight in the war between the states at 17 and had come back for 3 weeks in 1864 and then gone again and had not come back the second time. Dexter had been 12 years old when James left for the second time and 15 when the letter arrived, and the 3 years in between he had spent waiting, which was its own particular education and how much loss cost. You thought if you loved something enough to wait for it, it would leave anyway, Della said. Something like that, Dexter said. James didn't leave on purpose, she said gently. I know that, but at 12 years old and then 15 the fact of it was the same. And your father? My father loved my mother the way he loved everything hard, and then harder until it broke, Dexter said. She spent most of my growing up years being worn down by it. She died when I was 17. I don't think she died of anything in particular. I think she just got tired. Della was quiet for a moment thinking about that. Then she said, You are not your father, Dexter. You sound very certain of that. I am very certain of that, she said. I have watched you with Walt Hennessy's horses for 2 months. I have watched you with the Hennessy children. You do not love things hard until they break. You love things carefully. So carefully that sometimes the things you love don't even know you love them. He was quiet for a long time after that. She let him be quiet. Is that a criticism? He said eventually. It's an observation, she said. You could stand to be a little less careful sometimes, with people who want to be loved and aren't made of glass. Is that an invitation? He said. Possibly, she said. And she took his hand, which she had not initiated before, and they walked the rest of the ridge trail with their hands together, and Cinder followed patiently behind them, and the valley below was white and still under the January sky. By February, Copper Cross had accepted them as a couple with the quiet pragmatism of a small community that has more pressing things to discuss, and also privately finds it satisfying when things work out the way they should. Ruth Hennessy made no secret of her approval. Walt Hennessy expressed his by asking Dexter if he'd be interested in a longer arrangement, not just through the current string of horses, but through the spring and potentially the summer, which was the Hennessy way of saying that Dexter was welcome to stay. Dexter said yes. He said it without the hesitation, without the reflexive look toward the road that had been his characteristic response to offers of permanence for most of his adult life. He said yes and shook Walt's hand and went back to work, and that evening he told Della, and she looked at him steadily for a moment and then smiled, and the smile was the one he had been working toward. March arrived, and with it the first warmth, the slow greening of the valley floor, the return of the birds from wherever birds went in winter. Della's garden began to show the first tentative signs of the planting she had done in late February, small shoots in the beds, the promise of things growing. She taught her school and tended her garden and walked with Dexter on Sunday afternoons and danced with him on Saturday nights, and the life she was building in Copper Cross had a texture and a warmth that she had not felt since before her father died. In April, Dexter Donnelly asked Della Barrett to marry him. He did it in the garden on a Sunday afternoon because gardens had always been honest places and because it seemed right that a beginning should happen in the place where things grew. He was not entirely smooth about it. He said several things in the wrong order and had to circle back, and there was a moment where he lost his place entirely and had to stop and take a breath, and the stopping and the breath were the best part of the whole speech because they were real. She waited while he found his place again. She waited with that full attention of hers, that warmth and patience, and when he got to the actual question she answered it before he finished asking it. "Yes," she said. "Yes. Come here, you terrible man." He came, and she held his face in her hands and she kissed him and he laughed, which was something she had been waiting to hear for a long time. His laugh was not something he gave away easily, but when it came it was completely genuine, and it lit up the careful, precise planes of his face with something uncomplicated and wonderful. They were married in June of 1879 in the Copper Cross Church by Pastor Hale, who was a compact, cheerful man from Ohio who took genuine pleasure in weddings. Half the settlement came. Ruth Hennessy organized the flowers. The Hennessy children were impossible to contain and ran around the yard all afternoon and were entirely wonderful. Judge Calloway walked Della down the aisle in lieu of her father, which was something Della had asked for, and which the judge accepted with a solemnity that was clearly covering something more tender. Dexter stood at the front of the church in his good shirt and his best boots, which were clean but were still unmistakably working boots, and he watched Della come toward him in a dress of ivory cotton that Ruth Hennessy had helped her make, with her dark hair up and the scratch on her cheek long since healed without a scar. And his face did that complicated thing that was difficult to read, except that it was not complicated at all. It was a man looking at his whole life coming toward him down a church aisle, and knowing that he was going to be, for the first time in a long time, exactly where he was supposed to be. "You look like you're trying not to cry," Della said quietly when she reached him. "I'm not crying," he said. "I know," she said. "You're doing it very well." Pastor Hale cleared his throat and they turned to face him, and they were married. Walt Hennessy had offered them the use of the small foreman's house on the far end of the Hennessy property, which was separate enough from the main house to be genuinely private and close enough to the barn for Dexter's work. It was a good house, solidly built of adobe with a wood frame addition, with enough room for a family, which was something both of them thought about but neither of them said out loud yet because there was time, and they were in no hurry. They settled into the life together with the ease of two people who have been fitted for the same life and are finally wearing it. Della continued to teach, because the school needed her, and because she was good at it, and because work was part of who she was. Dexter continued his work with horses, and his reputation spread through that part of the territory so that by late 1879 he had more work than he could manage and had begun, with Walt's encouragement, to think about whether there was a larger operation in the idea, whether he and Walt might go into proper partnership, running a horse breaking and training operation that could serve ranches from the Bradshaw Mountains to the Prescott Valley. In the autumn of 1879, which was almost exactly a year after the Runaway stage. Della told Dexter that she was expecting their first child. She told him on the porch of their house in the early morning, when the light was just coming over the eastern ridge and the air still had the cool edge of night, and he was drinking his coffee before heading to the barn. He went very still when she said it. In the particular way he went still when something was happening that was important enough to require his complete attention. Then he set down the coffee cup carefully, and he turned and looked at her, and his expression was that difficult-to-read, complicated thing again, except that she could read it now. She had learned to read it completely, and what it said was that he was full to the edges with something he did not have words for, something that was gratitude and wonder and the specific terror of loving something that you cannot protect against everything. She crossed the porch and stood in front of him and took his face in her hands the way she had done on the day he asked her to marry him. "Say something," she said. "I don't have the words for it," he said. "Then just say what you have," she said. He covered her hands with his and looked at her, and his voice was very low. "I am the luckiest man in the Arizona Territory," he said, "and I am going to do everything I can to be the man you deserve." "You already are," she said. "Not yet," he said, "but I'm working on it." "You have been working on it since Christmas Eve," she said. "I've been watching." They stood on the porch as the sun came fully over the ridge and lit up the valley in that particular golden way that October mornings in the Bradshaws produced. And Dexter put his arms around her, and she leaned into him, and they were both quiet for a while with the weight and the warmth of what was coming. The winter of 1879 passed in domestic warmth, with the preparation and the planning and the particular quality of anticipation that belongs only to the time before a first child. Ruth Hennessy was a voluminous and opinionated resource on the subject of pregnancy and childbirth, and Della accepted her guidance with gratitude and a certain amount of amused resistance to the more extreme recommendations, and Ruth accepted the resistance with the magnanimity of a woman who has had 3 children and knows that the unreasonable advice will be ignored and the reasonable advice will be taken, and this is as it should be. Dexter built a cradle. He built it in the barn over the course of several weeks, working on it in the evenings after the horse work was done, using pine from the upper slopes and joinery that was considerably more careful than the project strictly required. Walt Hennessy said it was the finest piece of furniture in the valley. Dexter said the joinery on the 3rd joint was slightly off, and Walt said nobody would ever know, and Dexter said he would know, and Walt said that was exactly what he meant, and Dexter grinned and went back to sanding. Their son was born in April of 1880, in the adobe house on the Hennessy property, with Ruth Hennessy presiding and Dr. Farris in attendance and Dexter sitting on the porch step outside, in a state of barely controlled tension that 4 of the Hennessy ranch hands found extremely entertaining from a respectful distance. The baby was healthy and large, and had, from the first moment, the gray-green of his mother's eyes, and they named him Thomas James Donnelly, after Della's father and Dexter's brother, because both names deserved to go forward. Dexter held his son for the first time sitting on the edge of the bed beside Della, and he looked down at the boy's face with an expression so undisguised and open that Della, who was exhausted and flushed and entirely spent by the work of the last several hours, found herself laughing softly at the sight of it. "You look absolutely terrified," she said. "I am absolutely terrified," he said. "He's so small." "He is not particularly small," she said. "Ask Ruth." "He's small to me," Dexter said. "Everything important is small to me. I'm working on that." "You're holding him just right," she said. He was. He was holding the baby with that particular careful attention he brought to things that were precious and not made of glass, the same quality he brought to horses and to her, and the baby was quiet in his arms and looking up at him with the unfocused gaze of the newly arrived, and the expression on Dexter Donnelly's face in that moment was the most completely readable thing Della had ever seen on him. It was love. Simply and entirely love, without qualification or fear. The partnership with Walt Hennessy was formalized in the summer of 1880, the operation taking the name Donnelly and Hennessy Horse Works, which was a modest name for what had become, by word of mouth and demonstrated quality, one of the most respected horse training operations in the Arizona Territory. They had taken on 2 additional hands and expanded the facilities, and Dexter had brought in a young man from Yavapai County named Eli Marsh, who had the natural feel for horses that could not be taught and could only be developed, and who reminded Dexter, in certain ways, of himself at that age, solitary and capable, and in need of someone who would pay attention to what he was good at. Della watched Dexter with Eli the way she had watched him with the Hennessy children, and she saw the same quality, the patience, the genuine attention, the gift for giving a young person the space to grow in the direction they were built for. He was, she thought, a better teacher than he knew. He would have been horrified to be compared to her, but it was true. She went on teaching through the summer and into the fall of 1880, and by then the school had grown to 31 pupils, and the settlement's population had grown correspondingly. As the silver mines north of Copper Cross continued to produce, and the Bradshaw Mountain country attracted the cattle operations that followed the railroad's slow expansion north. Copper Cross in 1880 was a different settlement from Copper Cross in 1878, still small, still tight-knit, but with the beginnings of permanence, the kind of permanence that shows up in the quality of buildings and the presence of children in schools, and the planting of fruit trees that won't bear for 5 years, which is the deepest statement of confidence in a place that human beings know how to make. In the late fall of 1880, Dexter found Della standing at the kitchen window one morning after Thomas had gone down for his midday sleep, and she had that expression that he had learned to recognize, the one she had when something was forming inside her that she had not yet decided how to say. "Something's on your mind," he said. "Always," she said. She turned around and leaned against the counter. "I've been offered the position of district school supervisor," she said. "Judge Calloway has put my name forward to the Territorial Education Board. It would mean overseeing the schools in 3 settlements, not just Copper Cross." "That's a significant thing," he said. "It is," she said. "It would mean more travel and more responsibility. Is it what you want?" She looked at him. "I'm asking what you think," she said. "This is our life, not just mine." "I know it is," he said. "I also know that you have been teaching 31 children in one room and doing the work of 3 people for 2 years, and the territory needs you to do more. So yes, I think it's what you should do." She was quiet for a moment. "You wouldn't mind the travel, occasionally, when I go to the other settlements?" "I would mind it," he said honestly. "And I would be fine, and you should do it." She crossed the kitchen to him and stood on her toes and kissed him firmly on the jaw, which made him duck his head and smile. "You are much better at this than you think," she said. "I have a good teacher," he said. She accepted the position. The Territorial Board confirmed her in January of 1881, making her one of the first women in the Arizona Territory to hold a supervisory educational position, which was noted in the Prescott, Arizona Journal in a brief item that pleased Judge Calloway enormously, and that Della read, and then set aside with the practical directness of a person who has already moved on to the work. Thomas Donnelly began to walk at 11 months, which was earlier than Ruth Hennessy said was strictly usual, and which Dexter took as a personal compliment, as if the child's physical confidence was a reflection of the landscape and the work around him. By the time he was a year old, he was a fixture in the horse barn, carried on his father's back through the morning rounds, or sitting on the fence rail under Eli Marsh's watchful eye, utterly fascinated by the horses in the way that seemed to confirm something that Dexter had suspected and was quietly proud of, and said nothing about. The spring of 1881 brought a wet season, rare in the high desert, and Della's garden produced with an abundance that surprised even Ruth Hennessy, who had gardened in the Bradshaws for 15 years. Tomatoes and beans and squash, and the particular variety of sweet pepper that Della had sent away from a seed catalog out of Santa Fe, and which Dexter had been skeptical of, and which turned out to be the best thing in the garden. He acknowledged this without being asked, which was one of the things Della loved about him. His honesty operated even when it went against his own positions. She was working in the garden on a morning in early June when Dexter came around the corner of the house with Thomas on his back and a letter in his hand, and his expression was the careful one, the one that covered something he was deciding how to say. "What is it?" she said. He handed her the letter. It was from a man named Garrett Donnelly in Laredo, Texas, and it said that Dexter's father, William Donnelly, had died of a stroke in March of that year, peacefully in his sleep, and that Garrett, a cousin Dexter had not seen since childhood, had written to inform him because no one else had known how to reach him, and the letter had taken 3 months to find its way to the Arizona territory. Della read the letter and looked at Dexter. He was standing in the sun with Thomas on his back, and his face was not grieved exactly, but it was not simple either. He was a man looking at the last of an old weight. "How do you feel?" she asked. "I don't entirely know yet," he said. "I haven't spoken to him in 10 years. I don't know that I feel what you're supposed to feel." "You feel what you feel," she said. "There's no prescription for it." "I know," he said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the letter in her hands. "I think I mostly feel finished, like a door that has been standing open for years just shut. Not badly, just shut." "Is that all right?" she said. "I think it might be," he said. "I think I needed it to be finished before I could be completely sure that I was different from him." "You have been different from him for years," she said firmly. "I'm starting to believe that," he said. Thomas, on his back, said something incomprehensible and grabbed a handful of Dexter's hair, and Dexter winced and reached back to detach the small fist with the careful patience of a man who has learned that the most important things in life require exactly this kind of gentle, steady handling. The letter was answered, briefly and civilly, and the door shut, and Dexter Donnelly stood a little straighter in the weeks that followed. The way a man stands when he has put down something heavy that he has been carrying for so long he forgot it was weight. In the fall of 1881, when Thomas was 18 months old and the operation at Donnelly and Hennessy was running at full capacity, Dexter and Walt had a conversation that had been building for months about the land adjacent to the Hennessy property that had come available when its previous owner, a mining operation, had pulled out to follow a more promising seam further north. It was 120 acres of valley floor, good grass, with a creek running through it and a spring on the upper end. It was exactly the land that a permanent horse operation needed, and the price, by the standards of what the territory was beginning to cost, was reasonable. They bought it in partnership, Walt and Dexter, and filed the deed at the Copper Cross Courthouse, and that evening at dinner at the Hennessy house, a joint dinner, both families together, which was by now a regular occurrence and the social center of both households. Walt raised a glass of the slightly rough red wine that Ernesto Ruelas made in his cellar and sold quietly and said, "To putting down roots." Dexter raised his glass, and he looked across the table at Della, who was cutting Thomas's meat into pieces small enough for a toddler and simultaneously maintaining 3 separate conversations, and she caught his eye and gave him the smile, the specific one, the full one, not the public smile, but the one she saved for the private moments, and it crossed the table between them like something warm. "To putting down roots," he said. The second child, a daughter born in the summer of 1882, was named Clara Jane Donnelly. Clara for Della's friend in Tucson, who had sent the most enthusiastic letter of congratulations when the news of the marriage reached her, and Jane for no particular reason except that it was a good name, solid and true, and both of them liked it. She arrived with considerably more drama than Thomas, who had been a relatively straightforward labor, and with a set of lungs that Dr. Ferris described as exceptional. She had Dexter's coloring, fair where her brother was dark, and his eyes, which were a clear gray, and she took to the world with an energy and a definiteness that made Ruth Hennessy say, "That one knows what she wants," with the satisfaction of a woman who considers this a virtue. Dexter with his daughter was the most purely tender thing that Della had ever witnessed in her life. He held her with even more care than he had held Thomas, though he held Thomas with enormous care still, and he had a way of talking to her that was a variation on the hoarse voice, the low, even, infinitely patient voice, and Clara quieted every time she heard it, which was the beginning of what became a lifelong pattern of the two of them being able to communicate without words. Copper Cross in 1882 was a real town, not quite a city but something that had decided what it was. The school had been moved to a proper building, built with materials that the settlement had fundraised for over 2 years, with 2 rooms now and enough space for the growing enrollment. Della's supervisory position had expanded her work and her influence, and she had been instrumental in establishing schools in 2 additional settlements in the valley, and the women who taught in those schools wrote to her and consulted her and treated her, she sometimes thought with a mixture of pride and embarrassment, as though she knew what she was doing, which she did, but knowing what you were doing and being comfortable with being treated as if you knew were different things, and she was still working on the second one. Dexter's reputation as a horse trainer had spread past the Bradshaw country and into the broader territorial circuit, and he had been asked 3 times to come work on operations further south, and 3 times he had declined politely, because he had a ranch and a family and work enough where he was. The declinations came easily now, without the old reflexive pull toward the road. The road was not calling him the way it had. The road had lost its voice somewhere in the last 4 years, replaced by something better, something that asked more of him and gave back more than the road ever had. He still rode the ridge trails sometimes, early mornings when the work allowed, just him and Cinder, who was aging now, moving a little stiffly in cold weather, but still sound and still his preferred company for a long ride. He rode the trails and looked at the country and felt, in those mornings, a satisfaction that he had not known he was capable of feeling, not the absence of pain, which was what he had mistaken for happiness in his years of moving, but the actual presence of something good and solid and real. On one such morning in October of 1882, he tied Cinder to a juniper on the ridge above the valley and sat on a flat rock and looked down at the Copper Cross Valley in the early light. He could see the town from up there, and the church and the school, and at the far end of the valley the Hennessy property with its barns and corrals, and a little separate from the main buildings, the adobe house with the wood frame addition and the garden that was going dormant for the winter. He could see, even from the ridge, the smoke from the kitchen chimney. Della would have Thomas and Clara at the breakfast table, and the house would be full of the sound of them. He sat on the flat rock for a while and let himself have it, the fullness of it, without keeping any part of himself at a distance from it the way he had for most of his life. He let it be real. He let it be his. Then he rode back down the ridge to the barn, where Walt was already at work, and Eli was starting the morning routine with the horses, and the day began. In the spring of 1883, Della received a letter from Mrs. Constance Ruiz in Tucson, who was 80 years old and apparently indestructible, and who reported with characteristic directness that the building that had been Barrett and Sons was now a hardware emporium, which she considered a reasonable use for the space, and that the Santa Fe line had indeed come through the south end of Tucson as everyone had predicted, and that Clifton Hoare had sold the building to the railroad company for a considerable profit and had left Tucson for San Francisco, which was where people went when they had more money than character. Della read the letter and felt, very briefly, the old grief for what had been lost, her father, the store, the life that had existed before the fall and the broken hip and the failing heart. She felt it and let it move through her, and then she folded the letter and set it on the kitchen table and went to find Dexter in the barn, because she had learned that this was what you did with old griefs. You let them pass through you, and then you went to find the thing that was still here and still real and still yours. She found him working with a young paint horse that had been sent up from a ranch near Wickenburg, a difficult animal that had resisted 3 previous trainers. He was in the corral with the horse, moving in that slow, deliberate way of his, asking nothing and waiting. The horse was watching him. The horse was beginning tentatively to consider the possibility that this was not a situation requiring terror. She leaned on the fence rail and watched. After a while, Dexter glanced at her, read something in her face, and handed the paint horse's lead to Eli without a word. He came to the fence. "Everything all right?" he said. "It is now," she said. "I just wanted to see you." He looked at her with that expression, the one she could read completely, the one that said she was the center of the world he had chosen to build, without drama, without qualification, simply as a fact. "You always know where I am," he said. "I do," she said. "I find that enormously satisfying." He leaned across the fence rail and kissed her briefly and warmly, which made Eli Marsh find something to look at in the other direction, and made the paint horse take a curious step toward the fence, which was more progress than 3 previous trainers had achieved in a week. The years settled into themselves. Thomas started school in 1884 and revealed an aptitude for mathematics and a passion for horses that combined to produce, by the time he was 8, a child who was doing the accounts for the horse operation and had strong opinions about the breeding prospects of every animal in the valley. Clara was in the school by 1886, having announced at 4 years old that she was ready, and Della had assessed her daughter with the honest eye of a teacher and agreed, which created the mildly surreal situation of a mother teaching her own daughter, which they both managed with a dignity that impressed everyone who observed it. Dexter added a 3rd room to the house in the summer of 1885, because the house had become inadequate to the family it contained, and he built it the way he built the cradle, more carefully than strictly necessary, with the joinery checked and rechecked, and the finish work done with a deliberateness that Walt said was admirable and slightly maddening. Della said it was perfect. Dexter said the second window frame was very slightly off plumb. Della said she would never tell him where it was. Copper Cross became incorporated as a proper township in 1886, which meant a mayor and a town council, and an ordinance about livestock on the main street, and Judge Calloway was elected the first mayor with no opposition, which was appropriate, and he served in the role with the same soldierly practicality that he brought to everything else, and the town began to look like what it was becoming, a permanent place in the world. Dexter was asked in 1887 to join the town council, which was a thing he had not expected, and which he accepted after a conversation with Della in which she pointed out that a man who had been in the territory for 9 years, who had established a successful operation, who was known and trusted throughout the valley, and who had the rare quality of saying what he actually thought rather than what was expedient, was exactly the kind of person a town council needed. He served on the council with the same attention and patience he brought to horses, which turned out to be exactly the right approach to local governance in a frontier settlement where the issues were practical and the solutions required more honesty than brilliance. They had a 3rd child in the spring of 1888, another boy, whom they named William after Dexter's father, because Della had suggested it one evening and Dexter had gone quiet for a moment and then said yes, that was right, that a name was not a man and a boy deserved to start clean. William Barrett Donnelly arrived in the world with his father's coloring and his mother's gray-green eyes, and a temperament so even and unruffled that Dr. Farris, who had delivered all 3 Donnelly children, said he had never seen a baby so apparently at peace with the world. "He gets that from you," Dexter said to Della the first evening when the doctor had gone and Ruth had gone and the older children were asleep, and they were alone with the new baby in the lamplight. "He gets it from you," Della said. "I am not peaceful," Dexter said. "You are the most steady person I know," she said. "Quiet is not the same as peaceful, but steady is very close to it. He'll grow up knowing what steady looks like." Dexter looked at the baby, at his 3rd child, at this new small person who carried both of them forward into a future he had once been too afraid to want. He felt the fullness again, the same thing he had felt on the ridge that October morning, the thing he had made himself a gift of by learning to stop holding it at a distance. "I think I did something right," he said. "Eventually." "You did many things right," Della said. "Eventually." She was smiling when she said it, the full smile, the one for private moments. "Eventually," he agreed. He took her free hand, the one that was not supporting the baby, and held it in both of his carefully, the way he held everything precious. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" she said. "For being on that stage," he said. "For it being the stage I was riding above. For everything that had to go wrong, for everything to go right." She looked at him, this man who had stopped a runaway stage with his bare hands and opened the door and found her, this man who had been afraid and run and come back and stayed and built and become, in the years she had known him, the fullest version of himself, the man who was always already there under the fear and the road and the two inadequate words on a porch note. "The brake line broke," she said. "Gus went off the box. The horses bolted. You happened to be on the ridge." "Yes," he said. "And here we are," she said. "Here we are," he said. Outside the window, the Bradshaw Mountains were dark against the night sky, and the creek ran in the lower pasture, and the horses moved in the barn, and the town of Copper Cross was quiet around them. The lamp made a warm circle of light. The baby slept. In the morning, Dexter would be in the barn before dawn, and Della would have the school, and Thomas would do the morning accounts, and Clara would argue cheerfully about something. And the day would begin the way days do when they are part of a life that is fully, completely lived. But for now, in the lamplight, with the baby between them and her hand in his, they were simply here. Not running, not afraid. Not anywhere else in the world except this house, this room, this moment, which was the only place that had ever mattered, and which they had come to by the long road of their particular history. By a runaway stage and a pair of bleeding hands and the gray-green eyes of a woman who had the courage to say a true thing out loud, and then wait, with patience and dignity, for a man to find his way back to it. And he had found his way. The road had ended here, in Copper Cross, in the adobe house with the wood frame addition, and the garden that came back every spring, in the work and the family and the life that asked everything of him and gave back more. He had found his way, and he had stayed. And staying, it turned out, was not the small or frightened thing he had believed it to be. Staying was the bravest thing he knew how to do. He looked at Della in the lamplight. She looked at him. They said nothing because everything had been said, and what remained was better than words. Outside, the stars came out over the Bradshaw Mountains one by one, the way they do on clear Arizona nights, until the sky was full of them from ridge to ridge, and the world was wide and quiet and good.